So welcome everyone. This is the sixth session of Global Solutions to Peace, Equality, and Sustainability. I'm Mary Wynne Ashford, and I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ peoples who have cared for this land for many, many centuries. And I'm just going to share screen now and do the PowerPoint slide. Okay. So this anti-corruption court is one of my favorite topics. I really knew very, very little about this until I read the book on global governance and then started following the actions that are happening on this, because corruption is one of the most serious problems that we're facing, and resolving it would just be incredibly valuable to the world. So what is corruption? Well, it means the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. In other words, that leaders steal the money from the public trust, from taxes and from income from various resources, and they hide them in private bank accounts in foreign countries. They try to get them out of their country so that they'll still have the money even if they're kicked out of office. Transparency International is a really, really important non-governmental organization that's been working on these issues for decades and has really been very, very influential at the UN. Grand corruption means that the whole government is corrupted right from top to bottom. And at that point, it's also known as a kleptocracy, meaning rule by thieves. Grand corruption means that everyone is stealing from the public: the government, the army, the judiciary, and the police. So you can't complain to the police or take someone to court because everyone is in on it. And this is a lovely image of shaking hands above board and below you're passing money. So in captive nations, there are many, many problems that arise. First of all, that elections are not free and fair. And even if we go to observe them, it's extremely difficult to observe all of the parts of the election to be sure that it's free and fair, but mainly they are controlled to keep the kleptocrats in power. Secret bank accounts, I've listed Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Switzerland is beginning to clean up, but there are actually secret bank accounts in countries all over the world, including probably the United States and Canada. Money laundered in Canada has been a serious problem. And you may know that in my province, British Columbia, we found that casinos were laundering money. So what that means is someone makes, let's say $1 million from selling women or children into slavery, and now they've got this cash that they have to get rid of somewhere and make it legitimate. So they're not going to put it in their banks in their own country in case they get caught. So what they do is take it to a casino in Canada or wherever, and they buy gambling chips with that money, and then they gamble for a little while, and then they cash in the chips. Well, now that money is coming from the casino and there is a receipt. So it's now legitimized money. So that's what is meant by money laundering. Dirty money is made into clean money. Excuse me. There is a culture of impunity, and that exists because the corrupt leaders control the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. And also the media. We know that we don't find out about these things. So just one example recently was the Prime Minister of Bosnia, who was arrested for corruption in the purchase of defective ventilators from China. So he could pay what should be the correct amount, but because he was buying them and they were defective, he actually paid China a small amount and kept the loose change, so to speak, of millions of dollars. At any rate, he is no longer in office. Nave Pillay was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I think she was the first one who was appointed, and she brought attention to the human rights consequences of corruption. She said that 5% of global GDP is lost to corruption. That is enough to feed the world's hungry 80 times over. Corruption denies them their right to food and, in some cases, their right to life. She goes on to say 10 times more is lost to corruption in developing countries than they receive in foreign aid, robbing them of funds that their citizens desperately need for healthcare, education, and indeed to stay alive. The World Bank estimates that every year corrupt officials worldwide steal about 20 billion US, 20 to 40 billion from money that is intended as development assistance. And so when people say, well, it doesn't seem as if all the billions we pour into helping impoverished countries doesn't seem to make any difference. That's true, because the money isn't getting to the people. The money is being peeled off by the corrupt officials. Here are some of the impacts of grand corruption. First of all, human rights. You can't have human rights and that extent of corruption, because if you do, you will have people complaining out loud through the media about the corruption and calling the government out. So those people who are against the government have to be imprisoned or killed. Censorship of the media, and we're seeing this all over the world, but in particular, of course, we're seeing it in Russia now, and that's a great shame because they had started to make so much progress in the years of Gorbachev, when he said, we're going to have glasnost, we're going to have open media so that the media could discuss issues. Poverty and malnutrition, obviously the money is not going to either for the agricultural sector or to feed the people. Violence increases. The government is demonstrating that violence is the only way to solve problems. And you get the growth of organized crime, of course, throughout the entire country. Excuse me, you get a loss of dignity. This is a really important thing. I would call it a loss of trust. And I think this is one of the most significant issues that we're facing in the world right now, is that people don't trust their governments, and we don't trust them with good reason. And we need new systems of accountability. The anti-corruption court would be the beginning of that, that's for sure. Health suffers because money is not going into health. I looked at the statistics. I showed you the picture of the Prime Minister of Bosnia. In Bosnia, the most bribes were paid to doctors, which must mean that their healthcare system doesn't function properly, and people, in order to get any kind of healthcare, were having to use bribery. So it goes from top to bottom of society. I think that it changes everything. I think that it changes the trust that you have with the tradesmen who come to work for you. It changes whether you trust your teachers in schools. Education is another one. In some countries, you have to bribe the teachers in order to get the free education for your children. So the impacts are enormous, and changing this would make a huge difference. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, just recently said, the global COVID-19 pandemic is increasing the risk of corruption from the health sector to public procurement, stimulus packages, and rescue funds. A strong recovery must include measures to prevent and combat corruption and bribery. So we've talked about importing inadequate PPEs, inadequate equipment from various countries, including China. During the Ebola epidemic, the Red Cross lost $5 million in aid to Liberia through fraud. Da-da-da, here comes our hero. This is Judge Mark Wolf, who has been fighting against corruption in his career as a lawyer, as a judge in the United States and Massachusetts. And he has proposed the International Anti-Corruption Court. And I asked you to watch one or two of his videos online as a homework assignment for this course. And I hope that you got as much enjoyment from them as I did, just watching this man who is just headed straight forward to say, yes, we can actually do this, and talking about the countries where they're beginning to have success. The United Nations held conferences about corruption, and in 2005, they established a convention against corruption. And as you know from other classes in this, the conventions are not enforceable. The countries are not held to account through a court of law. But nonetheless, by now, 188 parties have signed on. Just a quick statement here. When we say states parties, we mean states that have signed on to a convention or a treaty or a declaration are called states parties. And last week, someone asked me, what is COP26, that the meetings are starting the 1st of November. That stands for Conference of Parties to the Paris Convention. So regarding the environment. So that's what COP26 is. And it's the 26th annual meeting of the states that have signed on to that convention. Now back to this topic. This is the video that I want you to watch, and it explains about the UN Convention Against Corruption.
What is corruption? Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It hurts everyone whose life, livelihood, or happiness depends on the integrity of people in a position of authority. Sometimes its devastating impact is more visible. A father without shoes because he has to pay to get his child into a free school. A small shop owner weekly bribing the local inspector and cutting his modest earnings. Other times, corruption's impact is less visible. The corporation securing a contract through big-hearted kickbacks to corrupt government officials. The lower safety standards buildings, passed thanks to under-the-counter bribes, collapsing in an earthquake. To strengthen the fight against corruption, in 2003, countries in the United Nations concluded a convention against corruption. The UNCAC is the first global anti-corruption treaty and takes a comprehensive approach to tackling corruption worldwide. Ratified by 148 states by 2010, it includes obligations for governments to prevent and criminalize corruption and to cooperate internationally with other countries. The UNCAC is a major landmark, but only with constructive monitoring will governments take the UNCAC seriously. The countries that are party to the UNCAC adopted a review mechanism, the first ever peer review process in the United Nations system. The mechanism has 3 bodies which support the review process. All the states that are party to the UNCAC must be reviewed by peer review teams made up of experts from 2 reviewing countries. The review will X-ray domestic bribery, foreign bribery, embezzlement, money laundering, liability of companies, whistleblower protection, mutual legal assistance, and more. Civil society participation is a key element of a credible review process. CSO's role is to check government's progress in implementing the UNCAC, give suggestions for improvement, and provide support for governments to learn from good examples and to take similar actions.
Only in this way can information be passed, in this way can information be shared by all, and only in this way can society at large determine how the country is faring in its fight against corruption and which are the areas that require additional attention.
The UN also had a special session on corruption this year in June, from the 2nd to the 4th of June, and it was called UN General Assembly Special Session. That's what UNGAS stands for. So once again, they committed themselves to work for, to get rid of corruption. And on June the 10th, and I think this is very significant, so immediately after that meeting, world leaders called for an international anti-corruption court. And this is a picture of the 4 leaders from Canada. And I'm just going to read to you this brief announcement. This is from June 10th. It was announced today that more than 100 world leaders from over 40 countries have signed a declaration calling for the creation of an international anti-corruption court. The declaration advocates for a new international court to address the global problem of grand corruption, the abuse of public office for private gain by the nation's leaders, the kleptocrats, which thrives in many countries and has devastating consequences for human rights, human health, international peace, and security. And so the signatories from Canada are Ujjal Dosanjh up on the top left and Michael Ignatieff on the top right. Remember, he was the head of the Liberal Party. Ujjal Dosanjh was Attorney General of BC and then a federal minister. That's Alan Rock, who was our Minister of Health in the bottom, and Lloyd Axworthy, who was our foreign minister for many years. Lloyd Axworthy in particular has taken this up as a personal issue, and that's why I'm encouraged that we are going to see a lot more from this. The other issue that Lloyd Axworthy took up in the past was the what's it called? The
landmines.
No, yeah, the landmines. But then after that, it's the one of assistance to states that cannot or will not protect, the responsibility to protect. So Lloyd has a history of bringing things to the United Nations and actually making them happen. So I'm very encouraged when we see world leaders coming out publicly and saying we have to have this anti-corruption court. I watched a webinar with Judge Wolf, and he said that he feels that the development of the movement for an anti-corruption court is just to the same stage that he remembers with the International Criminal Court when it was just at the tipping point, and then nations began to adopt it. So I think we can be very, very hopeful about that. So this slide is just to remind you of all of the things that are affected by corruption. And when you go into your discussion groups, I asked you how you think, why you think nations would be reluctant to sign on to the anti-corruption court, and then why they would sign on to the anti-corruption court. But I want to add in this information so that you think about all of the effects that it would have if nations all over the world signed on. How would it affect climate change if we eliminated corruption? Well, for one thing, it would remove the bribes that are engaged with fossil fuels in every country and the governments that are holding on to them. Poverty, we've talked about that. How would it affect clean water, hunger, health, gender equality, education, inequality, and peace? I think I've talked about all of those.